to other news now. I'm sure you have very complicated and probably very difficult memories of the Covid-19 pandemic and what happened then and how it really changed our society. You may well remember the people you lost during that time and what we lost during the hard lockdown. But one of the things we may have gained was an appreciation of how important science is, how important facts are, and how it was science that brought us the vaccines and helped us get out of the pandemic during that time. During that time, one of the people you got to know really well was Professor Salim Abdul Karim. He ended up being a major part of the public face of science during that time. Well, he's written a book about the experience. It's called Standing Up for Science, and he's here with you now. Professor Salim Abdul Karim, it's good to see you. It's good to see you without face masks. Thank you for coming in.
Very good afternoon, Stephen. It's great to see you in person.
I think many of us have tried to forget the pandemic. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do. I don't think it is. We shouldn't do that. Why have you decided to write a book about it?
Well, it all started back in 2020 in September when I was just thinking about this moment and the importance it would have for us in the future. Given that this is not the first pandemic we're dealing with and certainly is not going to be the last, I thought it was important to document the experience and, importantly, to try and extract what are the lessons that we can take forward into preparing for the next pandemic. So that's how it originally started. And then it became just a labor of love to just capture what I was doing and how I was doing it. And I thought it would be just valuable for generations to come.
One of my first memories of the pandemic is speaking to someone who was a South African in Wuhan, in China, who was in lockdown and thinking, well, that'll never happen here. And about 2 weeks later, I remember driving home after work and seeing people in the street wearing face masks and thinking, I've now got to get some of these. When did you first realize how big this was going to be?
So I first knew of the case that was first initially reported on the 30th of December because I subscribed to an alert. This alert tells us about new epidemics and pandemics across the world. But I didn't really take much notice of it. In fact, I promptly ignored the alert. But it was about 11 days later that my colleague, Professor De Oliveira, came to my office and said, have you seen the sequence? And when he shared this with me, then I realized that actually we were dealing with something different from SARS. And that was the first time I sort of understood that things might actually get quite serious. But I think I went into a bit of a state of denial for a few days and weeks. And it was really by the end of January that it became much clearer to me that this was a serious problem. And by the middle of February, we had already started taking leadership and getting ready. We partitioned our laboratory. We set up the testing. We had started testing for COVID about 2 weeks before the first patient was ever discovered in South Africa. And the reason was very fundamental. We were not just going to sit back and let this pandemic happen to us. We were going to do what we could to be ready to identify it, to produce the information that was needed, to understand how the virus was spreading. All of that information, we wanted to be part and parcel of finding solutions.
One of the big roles you played, of course, was on the Ministerial Advisory Committee, and it was 2020, sort of March, I think. And suddenly, as the pandemic sort of burst onto the scene, suddenly dominating everything. And I remember sitting here, not quite in this chair, but on this program. And the only thing we discussed was the pandemic. And suddenly you were there, to an extent, I think, the face of science, or sort of a big part of the face of science. And part of that was about the Ministerial Advisory Committee. You can tell us now, what was it like behind the scenes there?
I mean, when the committee was established, it was established on the 23rd of March. And it was through a Zoom call that the minister hosted. There were about 50, 60 scientists on the call. And all of us had just been invited to just come and share whatever we knew about this disease. But towards the end of the meeting, the minister announced that actually he's creating a ministerial advisory committee on COVID-19. And all of us who were on the call, he'd like us to be members of this committee. And then the acting director general announced that I would be the chair of the committee. Now, he didn't ask me, but he didn't need to ask me because I would not say no to such a request. But that became, the point at which I understood the enormity of the challenge I was facing. And it was that very evening that the president announced the lockdown. So it came as much a surprise to me as it did to everyone else that we were, going into this lockdown. And I remember, preparing for this and trying to understand because people were going to ask me, why were we doing this? And I started reading up, and there's so little written about lockdowns, and so we had to really grapple with that issue from Wuhan. And I think as it was, the committee itself did amazing work. I mean, just think about it, in 1 year, we were producing about 2 advisories a week, and they were really excellent in terms of the science that was thought through, the recommendations that were made. And I look today in hindsight and think that I had an amazing opportunity to work with amazing colleagues in putting together what is the essence of our response to COVID-19.
It seems to me that that if a group of politicians in South Africa had announced a lockdown, I don't know if people would have accepted it. What was needed was legitimacy. Now, the government has legitimacy. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But the scientists gave it legitimacy, and I mean that in a positive way. And I think there are a few reasons for that. The one is that the scientists were available. They spoke to every radio station, every television station. They answered questions, you and others, explained things very clearly. Did you realize that that was happening at the time?
I have to tell you, it took me aback. So I've been providing science advice, to governments across the world, to the United Nations, and I've been doing so for more than a decade. I was chief science advisor to the head of UNAIDS, for example. But my job has always been a backroom job.
Yeah.
I sit at my computer, I crunch numbers, I produce graphs, and I show, people who are in authority what the evidence shows. But it's their decision. It's their, what they decide to do with it is up to them. And then they must stand in front of the cameras and defend their decisions. But COVID changed that. It took scientists like myself, who are used to the back room, and put us in the limelight. It's a completely new experience. And for me, it gave me an opportunity to really understand and explain to people in a very simple way what the evidence is, what we know, and what we don't know. And I've been very careful. I'm not one to say what you should do. I'm one to tell you what the evidence suggests are the options, and then you decide. So my job is to empower people to make the right decisions for them.
A key person at the time was Dr. Zweli Mkhize, and this is a sequel to this, but we'll get to that in a moment. Yeah. But he was probably on TV almost as much as you. But you would have spoken to him quite often. What was that like?
Well, when it first started back in March, I was talking to him almost every day. And, he had a very hectic schedule because he was doing so many things. And he believed in leading from the front on the ground. So if there was a problem in the Eastern Cape, he was in the Eastern Cape. If there was a problem in Cape Town, he was in Cape Town. And I would expect somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, my phone is going to ring. And it's him at the end of his day now. He's going to call me and say, these are the problems that he's encountered. He needs advice on these issues. And can I, just give him some quick advice verbally, and can I write for him some responses about what should be done? So, to me, he was the kind of person that we needed at that time to lead us, because he understood the science, he wanted to hear from the scientists, and he took scientists quite seriously.
I remember the shock very early one morning when I read the first story about digital vibes. I remember thinking, wow. I've reported on the minister for years. I've interviewed him face-to-face. There's those moments after interviews. Tira Mata was the person who would arrange those interviews. Must have come as a shock to you, too.
I was blown away. I know Zweli Mkhize and his wife from medical school. He was the head of the Medical Students Representative Council. He was 1 year ahead of me in medical school. I mean, he was our leader in medical school. I respected him. I've worked with him over many years. And I would never, ever have guessed that he would be involved in anything like this. So it came as a huge shock.
We still don't know what's really going to happen around that, do we, with the SIU? One of the things that I noticed, and it was very easy for me, I'm a loud, confident person, I think you know that about me, but I'd go to a social gathering such as they were, or my Twitter account would fill up with the anti-vaxxers, a crowd who love you deeply. And, you know, I would find myself being assailed by people who would accuse me of all sorts of things. I'd hear this phrase, mainstream media, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. It must have been really difficult for you and for your family. People got very personal.
You know, it's very unfortunate. So I'm used to people attacking the science and attacking the issues around HIV. I mean, I dealt with HIV denialism. I dealt with people, you know, who refused to believe that this even existed. And I dealt with people who believed that it was made by the U.S. government and, you know, was an attempt to kill all the, you know, the gay people in this world. So I've dealt with many people who had differing views that were anti-science. But I think in COVID-19, it was different. It was different in two ways. One is that in HIV, we didn't have social media.
Yeah.
And now, in COVID-19, what you had was people are somewhat anonymous, and they can say things without taking any responsibility for you know, their actions. And what happened was that it became almost like a group think. So one person said it, another one echoed it, and you got all these bots amplifying it. And so what happened was that it became, in a way, a chant against science. And it became very sad because not only did it sow distrust in science, but it became personal in some instances. It became personal. Now, people were attacking me. You know, when you can't attack the issue, you know, if you can't attack the ball, attack the person, attack the player. And so that's what happened. They shifted from the issues because they didn't have anywhere to argue their points. And it became about attack me, you know, attack anything about me that you could. I think that's a very sad reality that we've had to stoop to that level. And I think for me, the worrying thing is the spillover effects that that's going to have on childhood immunization. We're already seeing that. And that's very unfortunate. And I hope that, you know, people will take my call somewhat seriously to say, you know, every one of us needs to be an ambassador of the facts, of the science, ambassadors and myth busters, so that we don't allow these myths to stand, but that we stand up for what is right and what is scientifically accurate.
Standing up for science, it's a really important thing to do. And you've done it for many years. And you write a little bit, not very much. I look forward to another book on it, maybe, about what happened 21, 22 years ago. And I'm talking about the AIDS denialism period. I'm talking about the AIDS conference that was held in Durban. I'm talking about former presidents Thabo Mbeki, who amazingly at UNISA repeated his claim quite recently that HIV does not cause AIDS. I never thought I'd have to fact-check a former president, but that's what happened. I remember it very clearly. He's the Chancellor of UNISA, and yet he holds this view. He's the Chancellor of the University of South Africa. How do you feel about that?
Well, it gets even more ironical because at the end of 2021, I received an award from UNISA, and it actually is the Chancellor's Award that I received. And so I was actually in Johannesburg to collect the award. And I wondered whether I would be collecting it from ex-President Mbeki. And it turned out, yes, he was there, and he handed over the award to me. And to me, what was striking was that I was receiving an award for standing up for science in COVID-19 from the very person that I also had to stand up for science in HIV. But I think, you know, the president is entitled to his views, but when his views impact the public and when they take on repercussions where people stop taking their treatment, unfortunately, it's no longer just his views. And so it's very important that, you know, all of us who understand the science, who know the science, stand up for it, and to make sure that the anti-science perspective is not one that dominates the discourse of the day.
Professor, thank you very much indeed. There's so much more to talk about from that time, and I think there'll be more conversations to come. Professor Salim Abdul Karim, the director at Caprisa and the author of the book, Standing Up for Science. Professor, thank you very much indeed.